Welcome back, everyone. This is the Level 4 Robber of my new Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg series, where we will cover almost everything from alien civilizations to government mysteries. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this series, and of course, thank you for watching. Tear Killer. The Tear Killer is a chilling moniker attributed to a series of murders that took place in the late 1990s in a small town shrouded in mystery. The killer earned this name due to the unusual and unsettling calling card left at each crime scene, a single tear-shaped symbol often carved into a nearby surface or left as a small token near the victim's body. The murders themselves were brutal, with each victim showing signs of severe physical trauma, but it was the eerie consistency of the tear symbol that gripped the town with fear. The first known victim was found in 1997, a young woman named Laura Green, who was discovered in her apartment with no signs of forced entry. The local police initially suspected someone she knew, but as more victims were found, each with the same tear symbol, it became clear that this was the work of a methodical and deeply disturbed individual. The victims had little in common, different ages, occupations, and social circles, adding to the challenge of identifying a motive or pattern. As the investigation intensified, the media dubbed the perpetrator the Tear Killer, and the case became a national obsession. The police formed a special task force, but despite their efforts, the killer seemed to always be one step ahead, leaving behind no usable forensic evidence. The town, once quiet and peaceful, was now gripped by paranoia and fear, with residents locking their doors and avoiding the streets at night. In 1999, the murders suddenly stopped as mysteriously as they had begun. No further clues emerged, and the Tear Killer seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of sorrow and unanswered questions. Over the years, several suspects were investigated, but none could be conclusively linked to the crimes. Some believe the killer may have died or been incarcerated for an unrelated crime, while others fear he could still be out there waiting to strike again. The Tear Killer case remains unsolved, a haunting chapter in the town's history. Despite occasional renewed interest in cold case investigations, the identity of the Tear Killer remains one of the darkest and most enigmatic mysteries of the late 20th century. The tear-shaped symbol, once a mark of unimaginable horror, continues to linger in the memories of those who lived through the terror, a grim reminder of the killer who was never caught. Slavemaster. The Slavemaster was a nickname given to John Edward Robinson, a seemingly ordinary man who lived a double life as a sadistic criminal mastermind. Active primarily in the 1980s and 1990s, Robinson exploited the early days of the internet to lure victims into his trap, presenting himself as a successful businessman and a charming figure in various online chat rooms dedicated to BDSM, bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, sadism, and masochism. But behind this facade was a cold-blooded killer whose crimes shocked the nation. Robinson's criminal activities began long before he earned the Slavemaster title. In the 1980s, he was involved in various fraudulent schemes, often posing as a wealthy businessman to con people out of their money. His charm and manipulative skills allowed him to gain the trust of his victims easily. However, his crimes took a darker turn in the mid-1990s when he started using the internet to meet women who were interested in submissive relationships. One of his early known victims was Sheila Faith, whom Robinson met online in 1994. Sheila and her 15-year-old daughter Debbie moved from California to Kansas City to be with him, believing that he would take care of them. Instead, both were murdered, and their bodies were stored in barrels on a storage property Robinson owned. Tragically, this became his signature method, killing his victims, placing their remains in barrels, and hiding them in storage units. As Robinson continued his killing spree, he created a complex web of lies to cover his tracks. He would tell the families of his victims that their loved ones had decided to move away, or that they had joined religious cults, even forging letters and documents to support his stories. His ability to manipulate and deceive both his victims and their families delayed investigations and allowed him to continue his murderous activities for years. Robinson's downfall began in 2000 when police, acting on a tip, searched his storage units and found the barrels containing the bodies of several women. The discovery led to his arrest and the unraveling of his horrific crimes. He was eventually convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death in 2003. To this day, it is believed that Robinson may have had more victims than those officially accounted for. The case of the Slavemaster remains one of the most disturbing in criminal history, highlighting the dangers of online interactions and the terrifying reality that predators can hide in plain sight. John Edward Robinson's ability to manipulate, control, and ultimately destroy lives earned him a place among the most notorious serial killers in modern history. His story serves as a grim reminder of the potential darkness lurking behind even the most charming of facades. Dorado Jane Doe. Dorado Jane Doe is the name given to a mysterious woman whose true identity remains unknown even decades after her death. Her story is one of intrigue, deception, and tragedy, a case that has puzzled investigators and captivated true crime enthusiasts since her death in 1991. The woman known as Dorado Jane Doe was living under the alias Mercedes in El Dorado, Arkansas at the time of her death. She had also used several other names during her life, including Cheryl Ann Wick, Shannon Wiley, and Kelly Carr. She was involved in a turbulent relationship with a man named James Ice McAlphin, a small-time criminal with whom she had been romantically involved for several years. On July 10th, 1991, following an argument, McAlphin shot and killed her in a motel room. When police began investigating her murder, they quickly realized that the woman had been living under false identities for years. Attempts to trace her back to her true origins hit dead ends at every turn. The name Cheryl Ann Wick she was using at the time of her death was traced to a woman in Minnesota who was still alive and had no connection to the victim. This led investigators to conclude that Mercedes had stolen Wick's identity. Over time, more details about her life emerged. She had lived in various states, including Texas, Louisiana, and Missouri, often working as a stripper or involved in the sex trade. Her connections to a criminal underworld suggested that she may have been running from something or someone for years. However, despite extensive efforts by law enforcement, her true identity remains a mystery. She carried no identification, and her fingerprints and dental records did not match any known missing person cases. In the years following her death, investigators have released composite sketches and details about her case to the public in the hope that someone might recognize her. DNA testing has been done, and while it has led to some potential familial matches, no definitive identification has been made. Theories abound about who she might have been: a runaway, a victim of human trafficking, or someone with a dark past she was trying to escape. But to this day, Dorado Jane Doe's real name and the full story of her life remain unknown. The case of Dorado Jane Doe serves as a haunting reminder of the countless individuals who live on the fringes of society, their stories and identities lost in the shadows. Despite the technological advances and efforts by investigators, her true identity has remained hidden, making her one of the most enigmatic figures in the annals of unsolved cases. Saturnino Valdes Lianos. Saturnino Valdes Lianos, a name shrouded in mystery and controversy, is tied to one of the most puzzling and debated cases in the history of Latin America. His story is one of intrigue, political unrest, and a disappearance that has left more questions than answers. Valdes Lianos was a prominent Cuban lawyer and journalist in the early 20th century, known for his outspoken criticism of the Cuban government and his involvement in anti-government activities. His legal acumen and sharp pen made him both respected and feared in political circles. He was particularly known for his opposition to the government of Gerardo Machado, a dictator who ruled Cuba with an iron fist from 1925 to 1933. In 1930, Valdes Lianos disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His disappearance occurred during a period of intense political repression in Cuba, and many believed that he had been abducted or killed by government forces due to his vocal opposition to the Machado regime. Despite efforts by his family and colleagues to locate him, no trace of Valdes Lianos was ever found. His disappearance became a symbol of the brutality of the Machado government and the dangers faced by those who dared to speak out against it. In the years following his disappearance, rumors and theories about Valdes Lianos' fate have abounded. Some believe he was secretly executed and his body disposed of in a way that would ensure it was never found. Others suggest that he may have been taken to a remote location and imprisoned for years before dying in obscurity. There are also those who speculate that he may have escaped Cuba and lived out the rest of his life under an assumed identity in another country, though no credible evidence has ever surfaced to support this theory. Valdes Lianos' disappearance remains an unresolved chapter in Cuban history, emblematic of the turbulent and often dangerous political climate of the time. His case is frequently cited in discussions about human rights, abuses, and the repression of dissent in authoritarian regimes. Despite the passage of time, the mystery of what happened to Saturnino Valdes Lianos continues to haunt those who study Cuba's history, a stark reminder of the perils faced by those who challenge power. To this day, the name Saturnino Valdes Lianos is remembered in Cuba and beyond as a symbol of resistance and the fight for justice. His story a poignant chapter in the broader narrative of Latin American struggles for democracy and human rights. His disappearance remains one of the many unresolved cases that illustrate the dark side of political life in the region during the early 20th century. Jacobo Grinberg. Jacobo Grinberg was a Mexican neurophysiologist and psychologist whose life and work were deeply intertwined with the exploration of human consciousness, spirituality, and the mystical traditions of indigenous Mexican cultures. His mysterious disappearance in 1994 has left a lasting enigma, turning him into a figure of fascination and speculation. Born in 1946 in Mexico City, Grinberg displayed an early interest in the mind's capabilities and the nature of reality. He studied psychology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, and later pursued a PhD in psychophysiology in New York. Throughout his career, Grinberg was driven by a desire to understand the brain's role in producing consciousness and how it could interact with what he termed the syntergic field, a concept he developed that suggested a universal energy field connecting all living beings. Grinberg's work took a unique turn when he began studying the rituals and practices of indigenous Mexican shamans, particularly the Mazatec healers. He became fascinated with the possibility that these traditional practices held keys to understanding consciousness and healing beyond the scope of conventional science. His research led him to publish numerous books and papers blending neuroscience with mysticism and proposing that shamanic practices could influence the syntergic field, thereby affecting reality itself. Despite his groundbreaking ideas, Grinberg's work was often dismissed by the mainstream scientific community as too speculative and unorthodox. However, he garnered a dedicated following among those intrigued by the intersection of science, spirituality, and indigenous wisdom. On December 8th, 1994, Jacobo Grinberg vanished without a trace. He was last seen at his home in Mexico City, where he lived with his wife, Teresa Mandala. His disappearance sparked widespread speculation. with theories ranging from foul play to abduction by government forces, or even a voluntary withdrawal from society to continue his research in secret. Some of his followers even suggested more outlandish possibilities, such as his having achieved a higher state of consciousness and transcended physical reality. The Mexican authorities conducted an investigation, but no conclusive evidence was ever found to explain Grinberg's disappearance. His case remains unsolved, and his body has never been discovered. The mystery is only added to his legend, with some viewing his vanishing as a final, inexplicable act that aligned with his life's work, an ultimate demonstration of the concepts he so passionately explored. Today, Jacobo Grinberg is remembered as a pioneer in the study of consciousness and the potential of the human mind. His disappearance remains one of Mexico's most perplexing, unsolved mysteries, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire both scientific and spiritual exploration. Janet Smith. Janet Smith was a young Scottish woman whose tragic death in 1924 became one of the most infamous murder mysteries in Vancouver, Canada. Her case stirred public outcry, scandal, and intense speculation, highlighting issues of race, class, and justice in early 20th century British Columbia. Janet Kennedy Smith was born in Perth, Scotland in 1902. In 1923, at the age of 21, she moved to Vancouver to work as a nursemaid for the wealthy Baker family. The Bakers were prominent figures in Vancouver society, and Smith's position with them placed her in the heart of the city's elite circles. On July 26, 1924, Janet Smith was found dead in the basement of the Baker home with a single gunshot wound to her head. At the time of her death, she was alone in the house with the Chinese houseboy, Wong Foon Sing, who discovered her body. The immediate conclusion by the police was that Smith's death was a suicide, but this explanation was met with widespread skepticism. The case quickly became a sensational story in the local press, fueled by rumors, racism, and public suspicion. Many believed that Janet Smith had been murdered, and the initial investigation was criticized as being cursory and biased. The focus soon shifted to Wong Foon Sing, who was arrested and brutally interrogated by the police. Despite the lack of evidence, he was held in custody for weeks under harsh conditions, reflecting the deep racial prejudices of the time. The public's demand for justice and the pressure on the authorities led to a second inquest, where the verdict of suicide was overturned. The new inquest ruled that Janet Smith had been murdered, but no charges were ever laid. And the case was further complicated by allegations that Smith had been romantically involved with a member of the Baker family or their social circle, adding a layer of scandal to the already murky circumstances. Despite multiple investigations and widespread media coverage, the true cause of Janet Smith's death remains unresolved. The case is often cited as an example of the racial and social tensions in Vancouver during the 1920s, where the rights and lives of marginalized individuals like Wong Foon Sing were often disregarded. Janet Smith's death has since become a part of Vancouver's dark history, symbolizing the injustices of the era and the enduring mystery of what truly happened to her on that fateful day in 1924. The case continues to intrigue historians and true crime enthusiasts, standing as a reminder of how prejudice and social divisions can impact the pursuit of justice. Poquianchis. The Poquianchis is the chilling name given to the Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters, who were responsible for some of the most horrifying crimes in Mexico during the 1950s and 1960s. Known as Mexico's most prolific serial killers, the four sisters, Delfina, Maria de Jesus, Carmen, and Maria Luisa, operated a network of brothels where they subjected countless young women to unimaginable cruelty, leading to their eventual deaths. The Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters were born into a poor family in the state of Guanajuato, Mexico. They grew up in a harsh environment, which some speculate may have contributed to their later criminal behavior. By the 1950s, they had set up a series of brothels, initially under the guise of legitimate businesses, but quickly devolving into sites of abuse, exploitation, and murder. Their modus operandi involved recruiting or kidnapping young women, often from rural areas, under the promise of work and a better life. Once at the brothels, these women were forced into prostitution, subjected to severe physical and psychological abuse, and often starved. The sisters were ruthless in maintaining control over their victims, and those who resisted or were no longer useful were brutally murdered. The bodies of the victims were buried on the properties or dumped in nearby areas. The sisters' reign of terror continued unchecked for years, largely due to the corruption and fear that permeated the local authorities. It wasn't until January 1964 when a woman managed to escape from one of the brothels and alerted the police that the full extent of the sisters' crimes was revealed. A raid on their properties uncovered mass graves containing the remains of at least 91 women, though it is believed that the actual number of victims could be much higher. The trial of the Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters captivated the nation. They were found guilty of numerous charges, including murder, human trafficking, and forced prostitution, and were sentenced to 40 years in prison each, which was the maximum penalty at the time. Delfina and Maria de Jesus died in prison, while Carmen died shortly after being released due to health issues. Maria Luisa's fate remains less clear, but it is widely believed that she also died in prison. The legacy of the Poquianchis is one of horror and tragedy, reflecting the dark side of human nature and the systemic failures that allowed such atrocities to continue for so long. Their story serves as a grim reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by women and the dire consequences of unchecked power and corruption. JAT 367 Flight. JAT Flight 367 is infamous not just for the tragedy it represents, but also for the miraculous survival story that emerged from it. On January 26, 1972, the McDonnell Douglas DC-9 aircraft was flying from Copenhagen to Belgrade with stopovers in Zagreb and Belgrade, operated by Jugoslavensky Aerotransport, JAT, the Yugoslav national airline. The flight was relatively routine until it reached the airspace over what is now the Czech Republic. And at approximately 33,000 feet, an explosion ripped through the plane. The cause of the explosion has never been definitively confirmed, though it is widely believed to have been a bomb planted by Croatian nationalists aiming to disrupt the Yugoslav government. The blast tore the DC-9 into pieces, causing it to plummet toward the ground. Remarkably, one person survived the disaster, 22-year-old flight attendant Vesna Vulovic. She fell an astonishing 33,000 feet without a parachute and lived to tell the tale, setting a Guinness World Record for the highest fall without a parachute. Vesna was discovered by a villager who heard her screams amidst the wreckage. She was critically injured, suffering from a fractured skull, 2 broken legs, and 3 broken vertebrae that left her temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. The fact that she survived such a fall is attributed to several factors. The section of the fuselage she was in became wedged between trees, which slowed her fall, and the snow-covered ground cushioned the impact. Additionally, her position in the plane at the time of the explosion may have kept her pinned inside the fuselage, preventing her from being thrown out like other passengers. After a lengthy recovery, Vesna was able to walk again, though she had no memory of the crash itself. Her survival was seen as a symbol of hope and resilience in the face of disaster. Despite the intense media attention, Vesna led a relatively quiet life afterward, avoiding the spotlight as much as possible. The JT Flight 367 disaster remains one of aviation's most mysterious and tragic incidents, with many questions about the explosion and the events leading up to it left unanswered. However, Vesna Vulovic's incredible survival story continues to captivate and inspire, a testament to the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Consider subscribing to our channel if you find our videos entertaining and informative to never miss updates.